Hello there. I hope you're doing well. It's been a little bit. I've been busy with work and life, and you know how it goes. Today I'm drinking Las Lajas Natural, which is an onyx coffee. It's got flavor notes of cherry, honey, and grape, and a little bit of chocolate, which is just delightful. Weather's been up and down here. We had a really unseasonal hot patch, and then it cooled down after some big thunderstorms, and now we're getting back to the heat. So this is going to be a little bit of a different one. So do you remember the show Sliders, where these group of protagonist heroes would basically had this mechanism to open up a portal, and they would go to these different versions of Earth?
What if you could travel to parallel worlds? The same year, the same Earth, only different dimensions. A world where the Russians rule America, or where your dreams of being superstar came true.
Ones where humans never existed. There were, just where JFK didn't die, all those sort of what if sort of things. And that, I would say, was kind of my first introduction to portal fiction or portal fantasy or whatever you want to call it, portal sci-fi. And I think the original version of Stargate, the movie, you could probably classify that as a portal fiction, going to an alternative, from Earth to an alternative Egypt in a way. I think this sort of thing is popular in the Fae fantasy community, but I haven't really read a whole lot of it. Last year when I was starting to think of starting this channel, I'd read a trilogy called the Findevar Tapestry by Guy Gravel K. And I picked it up because I saw an advertisement in a Folio Society version for the first book, The Summer Tree. And I hadn't read it. I hadn't even heard of this series. I knew the author, but he's like one of those authors that is a favorite of your favorite author. So he's probably more popular with the author community than with the reading community. But GGK is a fantastic author, and he does some really interesting things. And Findevar Tapestry is definitely a really interesting portal fantasy book, because it takes people from our Earth to like Earth Prime, which has all sorts of magic and sort of stuff in it. I hadn't really thought about portal fantasy or fiction in a while, so it was kind of my first reintroduction to the subgenre in a long time. I didn't read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, just wasn't really interested in reading C.S. Lewis. Not really sure why, I just never interested in the series. Maybe it's because it was a favorite of my brother's. You know how those can be. So in the Findevar Tapestry first book, The Summer Tree, it was an interesting book. It pulled together all sorts of myths, but really focused on a retelling of King Arthur's myth. And the characters that came through the portal were all part of King Arthur's court. They had a role to play. They had to help protect the Prime Earth. It was a fantastic read. I really enjoyed the series. There were some fun twists and turns in the stories, and I highly recommend it if you want a cool retelling of a story like that. I personally haven't really read much of Fae fantasy, just a subgenre I haven't really jumped into. The the Monk and the Robot is kind of, no, it's not. What did I read? Oh, the Butcher of the Forest was a Fae story, which I really enjoyed, and I thought it was really well done, and just, I think I'm hesitant to move into that subgenre, and a part of it is, in Patrick Rothfuss's series, the Wise Man's Fear, I just hated the section where the main character went into the Fae world. It just felt like a 12-year-old boy's wet dream. It was not interesting. It was like, I get that the main character Kvothe is an unreliable narrator, so maybe none of it even happened, but it still was just not interesting, and I just didn't really want to read the genre at all because of his implementation of it. That definitely isn't fair. As I mentioned, The Butcher of the Forest, which I've done another video of, that was really, really well done. It was super interesting. The main character walks in this forest, and because she walks into it a certain way, she goes from her real forest into this Fey world, and it's all horror, and all the Fey and all the creatures that are in this forest are, I mean, it's a straight up horror Fey story, and it was super well done. The most recent book that I read that's a Portal Stories is Doors of Eden by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and he's probably my go-to sci-fi author right now. I just read whenever I wrote this, I read the last book of the Philosophy of Tyrants and Kings series, and I just finished the Children of Strife, which is the most recent book in the series of Children of Time, which I really, really enjoy those series. Doors of Eden isn't Tchaikovsky's best work by Wade Martin. I found the general idea really interesting, which is that Earth has many diverging timelines, though each timeline only forks once. And so, if you watch the Story of Life, or, the Netflix series where it kind of goes through all the different major extinction events, you can kind of look at each one of those as options where Tchaikovsky says, okay, at this point there's evolution of sapient life. And again, I'm using sapient in terms of like intelligent life on par with humanity, because there's a lot of sentient life that he talks about throughout the book. I'm using the edge of sentience definition here, and if you want to know more about that, check out my video on that here, which I also used to talk about another Tchaikovsky book. But he talks about, like in the Cambrian period, where trilobites, which are these, you can kind of see the crab horseshoes of today are evolved into a very similar body type as the trilobites, but they grow into these sentient sapient creatures, and they evolve 500 million years ago. So they have 500 million years of additional evolution by the time that this book takes place. And each one of the different groups of these animals, or different groups of these intelligent life, is explained by an ongoing lecture provided by one of the Neanderthals that's really driving, and who are really not driving the major plot of the story. It's interesting, like I would say that the humans in the story, which are point of view characters, are kind of being pulled along, and the people with the most agency are the Neanderthals. And of course the humans do help in a lot of ways, and they're being pulled into it because they have an expertise and a different way of thinking about things, and that's why they're talking to humanity. But humans are also the antagonists in this story. These different parallel Earths are sharing the same space with each other, in that you can go between these different Earths, and in folklore, our folklore, fairy rings are different, which are generally rings of mushrooms. They are considered portals and to the Fey world. And if you read any Fey books, those sort of fairy rings are typically portals, or potential portals, into the Fey world. And I think that's how Kvothe gets into the Fey world in his books. It's not the only sort of one, and Tchaikovsky uses henges as another sort. And there's one in this Bottom Meyer that is called Six Brothers, but there's really only three stones on our Earth, three hinges. But whenever there's an overlap between this other Earth, then there's six of them. So at some point in time, these bird people, because they are dinosaurs that became sapient, basically raptors, they became sapient, and they and some humans from some distant past figured out that this overlap was there, and they put down stones to make sure that it was a remembered place. And the inciting incident is where you learn throughout the stories that one of the birdmen, as they're called in the book, because they look like birds. One of them is fasting and remembers all these stories from their past about this place where these stones turned from 3 into 6, and then the 6 stones appeared, and then the bird woman went through, found a farm, slaughtered some sheep, brought back a bunch of sheep, and the main point of view character, she was into cryptids, and they went and found them, and they accidentally went on the other side. And one of the main characters came back. Her name is Lee, and the other one is Mal. She stayed over on the dinosaur Earth and was there for 4 years before she was able to return, which is an interesting result, because Lee is traumatized by this, and the two women are girlfriends, or dating, and this flock of sheep are the only mammals in the dinosaur Earth, especially large mammals like this. And so it becomes a kind of a breeding stock for these dinosaurs in that world. I think generally the human characters are less interesting than the main idea of the story. Tchaikovsky primarily uses them as a human-centric perspective, even though there are some incredibly interesting characters, especially the Nisa, as Mal calls the Neanderthals. They're incredibly interesting people with very complicated habits and behaviors, and we only see them through the eyes of humans, of Homo sapiens, not Homo neanderthalis, which I think is kind of a huge shame. I think there's an opportunity to tell a very interesting story if you go in from their perspective, but we only ever see the human perspective, which I get the reason why people would do that, why Tchaikovsky would do that. It's easier to write. You don't have to try and write from this other alien perspective. Some of the characters are just super uninteresting. The two MI5 agents are a mixed bag. The man, Julian, is a very stodgy Englishman. I didn't really enjoy reading much of what he was doing in the story. But he very much grounds the story in the mundane, which I think is useful considering all the crazy things that are going on. But he was just kind of a boring character. He wanted to be James Bond, and he just was, a paper pusher, just a general blah character. Matchell is the other MI5 agent, and she's definitely an interesting character. She experiences some of the most growth in the book. She interacts with this supercomputer, and that makes her a more compelling character generally and more interesting for the Neanderthals and for the other creatures that know what else is going on. And Julian Sabrir, the stodgy Englishman, he just should have been pushed into more interesting places. Really, I think the only time where he has anything interesting going on is whenever towards the very end, where Tchaikovsky does something really interesting with the story. And I'm going to talk about this mostly because I thought it was really a highlight of the story. It kind of leans into the alternative Earth options. All the chapters were titled 17, one period. And then at this last portion, they are suddenly called 17./1 or 17./2. And I was a little confused whenever I first saw this. I was like, why did he change the naming convention? But, it was like a note that there was something going on here. And just by reading these, as you saw the 17 go up to 3, 4, 5, that these are different branches and that people are trying different things, and that it pushes people, like each one of them is somebody doing something slightly different, and that leads to different things. Some leads to an affair, some leads to people killing each other. Some are short-term successes, some are extreme failures. It's a very interesting way to expand the basic idea of the story and turn it into, like in a way you could almost look at it as like a roguelike where things are happening very rapidly and these changes are just diverging. It turns into something that happens every like basically every second instead of every million couple years. And during the book, Tchaikovsky also uses subheaders or scene headers of like I and I within the chapter, and this ramps up the point where it's like the same scene that happens over and over again. So he goes from like different character perspectives to like the same character so he really ramps up the number of branches. So you eventually figure out that there is something driving it, and the characters even figure out that there's something driving it, which is a major part of the book. And I thought it was really interesting, really well done. There's just a lot of the book that I was just felt like it dragged, which is one of the reasons why I thought it was not a great book overall. And this book is a great reading to think about two nonfiction books I've read, Humans and The Edge of Sentience. Both these books looked at what real scientists think about the specialness of humans in terms of sentience and sapience. Tchaikovsky doesn't use sapience in the books. He just says sentience. I think that he started to use the term sapience in newer books. He specifically does in Children of Strife, which I just finished reading. And I think that's a good change, because I do think we need to start using these terms differently. Sentience is just valenced emotions, directional emotions, because a lot of sentience was originally defined as based on if an animal can feel pain. But we know a lot of animals can feel a lot more emotions than just pain. They can feel excited, they can feel joy. I mean, I don't know how you can't look at a dog and think that there's a sentience there. But there's difference in an intelligence between what humans can do and what some animals can do. Maybe that's only because we can speak and we have a very complex vocal capability. But we're even learning, and Humans calls this out, that a lot of animals have a pseudo language or primitive language where they're able to convey a lot of information with different sort of tones. And I think that's fantastic. And I really do think Tchaikovsky should have used these differences in terms, because there are differences in the groups that he created. So one of them is a group of cockroaches that goes into a sort of intelligence as a group. And I would argue is certainly sentience, as described in The Edge of Sentience, which, Tchaikovsky calls them, but he also calls the trilobite sentience or the dinosaur sentient, but they're not, because they're sapient. They're beyond sentient. I mean, they are sentient and sapient, because they go on and have very complex ways of thinking, very complex societies. Dinosaurs are able to communicate with whistles, and basically bird calls become their language. Plus they have bird making or tool making intelligence, and they have a theory of mind, which I would kind of start to argue that theory of mind is heading towards sapience, which actually means that we need to be maybe creating another category, or being willing to expand what the categories of sapiens are, because theory of mind is certainly something that differentiates, some animals from other animals. And like crows have a theory of mind, some dogs have it, whales and dolphins certainly do, but other animals don't. And I think that's certainly an interesting thing. And there's planning involved, and a lot of animals have to have a theory of mind to be able to plan things. Yeah, so I think that this is a pretty interesting area to dig into from a science fiction perspective. And I think Tchaikovsky kind of does this very well across both Door of Eden. He does it very well with these Children of Time, which are other ways of exploring sapient intelligence. And I also thought it was interesting for Tchaikovsky to dig into this because it's a great way of digging into the alien nature of Earth based on real evolution. If you have watched Lindsay Nicole's That We Know Of series, that goes through evolution of really weird animals. Whenever Jaws hadn't evolved, like there's really weird creatures that were existing then. Or if you watch Extinct Zoo or some of the other paleo channels, they really highlight the weirdest of the weirds, and they're fantastic. Tchaikovsky generally uses better known creatures to evolve, but I think that makes it more accessible than picking like the pseudo shrimps or whatever to have those evolve. I think portal fiction is really interesting overall, and it allows for us, any normal person, to experience the unknown or magical. There's a lot of shows that do this, cartoons. It's a great way of doing the fish out of water view to really enable the audience to experience this new world. And I think it's great. And it doesn't require that the character to be a naive young coming of age character. Tchaikovsky has a couple young characters, but that is not because it's a coming of age story, but because they have some of their own. It provides a launching point for those characters and a way of maturing in a way that's interesting. And then he also has fully mature characters that are trying to grapple with the bizarreness of this world, and that in itself is interesting. So what do you think about portal fiction? Do you have a recommended series, or do you have a type that you think? Should I go back and read the line with the Chronicles of Narnia series of the books here? I would definitely recommend the Fandovar Tapestry trilogy if you want a longer story. But if you want a really quick one to feel like getting a good sense of what Fae and portal fiction is about, definitely recommend The Butcher of the Forest. It was fantastic. The Doors of Eden was good. I would recommend that as a later book if you want to just kind of get an interesting perspective on evolution. So let me know what you think below. Leave a comment. I really appreciate it. Let me know if I missed anything in Doors of Eden, if it was better than I thought. Maybe I was just tired of Tchaikovsky. Either way, I really thank you for spending your time with me, and I hope you have a good one.